everybody. Welcome to Artist Space Books and Talks. Thank you for all coming this evening. Tonight's event has been organised in relation to our current exhibition upstairs on the work of Richard Hollis, which opened last week. And we're very happy that Stuart Bailey agreed to speak tonight about Richard's work. Stuart was very pivotal to the organisation of this exhibition. It's a show that began in London last year, was shown at the gallery called Libby Sellers, organised by the curator Emily King, and has travelled to Lausanne and then to Pompidou and now to New York. But for this kind of iteration of the show, we invited Stuart to work with the material to kind of rethink the exhibition slightly. And Stuart previously worked with Richard Hollis in the late 90s, so it seemed like a really interesting position to come from in terms of looking at the work again. And this talk, in a way, is the culmination of some of that thinking, I believe. So without going on for too much longer, I'm going to hand over to Stuart for the talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. I'm going to start by just saying a few more thanks to everyone at Artist Space, Stefan, Stephanie, Jenny, Liz, Witz, Nico, Nathan, and also to repeat the thanks on Richard's behalf to Libby Sellers and Emily King, who, as Richard said, organised the first iteration of the show in London about 2 years ago now. I'm going to talk probably for about an hour, but I'd like to break it with some drinks at the bar in about 40 minutes and then carry on for about another 20, if that's okay. Straight away, I have to admit that almost everything I'm going to say tonight about Richard's work follows in the very large footprints of the British design critic Robin Kinross. He was the first to pinpoint the particularity of Richard's work in an article that was auspiciously titled The New Tradition back in the late 80s. This is one of 3 texts that are available to download from the Artist Space website, the other 2 being a conversation about design history between him and Richard a few years later, and a more recent piece that I wrote to try and get at what's special about Richard's way of working. With this talk, I'd like to continue this chain link and propagate this so-called new tradition. Robin used the term to flag the fact that Richard's work is very much its own thing, an approach that was certainly rooted in the modern movement, yet worked out in a unique way, personally, practically and pragmatically, on the ground, so to speak. And in recuperating that largely lapsed term, the modern movement, I mean to emphasize a specific set of attitudes related to, yet essentially distinct from more commonplace conceptions of modernism. Modernism is itself, of course, a famously slippery and promiscuous term, and one reason for supplanting it here is to circumvent this hydra-headedness, as it tends to blur into useless ambiguity. More specifically then, by modern movement, I'm alluding to a markedly socially grounded and implicitly socialist denomination of modernism, contrary to a set of stylistic tropes particularly common to the American conception. Generalizing wildly then, I could summarize this US-centric conception in terms of fine art with reference to Clement Greenberg's definition of the term as the self-awareness of a medium, working towards the realization of its most fundamental characteristic, such as the flatness of painting. Or I could equally summarize it in terms of graphic design with reference to the reduction to basic forms and one-liner concepts that played out particularly in the work for advertising and big business from around the 1950s onwards. By contrast then, the modern movement I have in mind has less to do with form or style, but consists rather in an attitude or disposition. There's a rhetorical shortcut to this in that I want to isolate the movement from the modern. Fundamentally, I think this is what Richard did. He took modernism and ran with it. Now, it's important to know that as well as being a graphic designer, Richard is also an important design historian and, to a lesser degree, a theorist. Actually, it's more accurate to say he was a very good distiller and synthesizer of other people's theories as part and parcel of his histories. He disliked overly academic writing and expressly avoided what he considered unnecessarily technical jargon like signifier and signifier. But he was always careful to explain why he was doing so, why he was avoiding it. Like his graphic work, he was concerned to write as engagingly and understandably for as wide an audience as possible, and this is one of the many ethical aspects of his work. Both the stuff that he makes and his accounts of other people's stuff is unusually clear-headed. As such, Richard is a great example of the point of learning the history of your discipline. As another teacher of mine once said to me, if you understand history, the present will take care of itself. Richard had his interests, his obsessions and influences like anyone else, but over 50 years of work, he also properly digested and transformed them. Furthermore, he's a rare instance of someone equally accomplished as a historian and a practitioner, and both roles significantly feed each other. In this sense, he lives in the same place in my mind as Jean-Luc Godard. It always amazed me to discover that Godard was an encyclopedic and outspoken film critic years before making his first film. How did he manage, I wondered, to make that first propulsive decade of movies without being hindered, if not entirely paralysed, by the weight of his own theoretical upbringing, as is far more common. And incidentally, Richard's design for Colin McCabe's book on Godard is one of the jewels of the show, unfortunately, but necessarily in one of the vitrines at the back of the room, at the far back of the space, so do make sure you see that. As ever, it's hard to overestimate seeing this stuff in the flesh, and we made every attempt to show them as such in the show. Graphic design is famously alien to art galleries because it's quoted so far out of context as to alienate any audience trying to grasp what makes it good. Let's begin with the definition. Richard has a very nice way of defining graphic design that's counterintuitively straightforward, again like much of his work. It's a deceptive tautology. Graphic design, he says, is what is made by graphic designers. He's not being funny, he's making the point that the vast majority of things that are categorically graphic weren't necessarily designed, meaning laid out, configured, articulated by someone who considers themselves a designer. Graphic design on Richard's terms, then, is work made by someone well aware that they're in the business of manipulating text and image, ideally according to meaning. And I use the word ideally deliberately too, because with this redundant sounding definition, Richard means to imply that this awareness is critical. That's to say, self-doubting and constructive. And from here it's only a short jump to say that graphic design is something made by someone committed to the idea that the practice has its own histories, theories, and peculiarities. For him then, calling something graphic design is already a value judgment. And on more than one occasion, he's lamented that this sense of engagement with the discipline of the discipline, is increasingly scarce. Now, I'm not sure I agree with that, though I know why he thought so, considering where the field seemed to be headed back in the early 90s when he said it. I'll come back to this later. This book jacket, which isn't to be taken that seriously, has been on a high shelf in the toilet next to Richard's basement studio in Clerkenwell, near King's Cross Station in London, for as long as I can remember. This is the view from the toilet seat a couple of weeks ago. And when I say as long as I can remember, that's to say around 1995, when I started working with him for a few years. I'd interviewed him for my undergraduate dissertation, and soon after he called and asked if I wanted some work. Basically, he just bought his first Apple Mac, and he wanted me to show him how to use it. However, I was equally as interested in learning what's called paste up, a technique that was fast approaching extinction at the time. Richard always says that graphic design can be considered in terms of its social, technical, and aesthetic aspects, and that far too much attention is devoted in writing and teaching to the aesthetic at the expense of the other two. As such, you miss at least 66% of what's interesting about the work. And with this in mind, let's begin with an overview of the technical. The social and the aesthetic will hopefully emerge in due course over the rest of the talk. In fact, the work upstairs in the exhibition crosses three technical paradigms, beginning in the late 1950s with letterpress. In this process, largely unchanged since Gutenberg, the emerging figure of the designer provided instructions for a printer to follow when assembling the metal or wooden type into a frame from which to pull an impression, sometimes together with engraved images. The designer at this point had to specify exactly in the printer's and the photo engraver's language, and was limited to the types the particular printer had in stock. Next, photo setting and offset printing started to supplant letterpress during the 60s. Here, the designer was required to literally paste up bits of paper. Strips of type, known as galleys, perhaps supplemented with dry transfer lettering, handwriting, or even sticking words letter by letter together onto a sheet. And I should emphasize this was something Richard particularly did. This wasn't that common, but you can see it manifest in a lot of the work upstairs. The composite result, the sheet, paste-up sheet, was then itself photographed and a printing plate made from the negative. Designers often had their own process cameras. This is an old PMT camera, and they made their own half-tone images, which is a physical equivalent of scanning today. And so they began to take control slowly of the production process. And photo setting has in turn been superseded since, of course, from the late 80s onwards by computer page makeup, which involves programming digital instructions in order to output on-off ink values to make plates without the need to go through a middleman at all. You can clearly see the traces of each of these processes from letterpress through photo setting to computer page makeup across the chronology of the work upstairs. The middle process I mentioned of paste up in combination with photo setting and offset lithography to make the master sheets for photo setting was probably used to make the majority of the work upstairs, so everything in the kind of middle, I'd say 70 or 80%. And it epitomizes the physicality that Richard speaks of. He often talks about how, and he talks about this in the film that's upstairs, that it's hard to imagine how absolutely physical making graphic design was in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The book cover gives you an idea of what's involved. The master was typically assembled at a drawing board, gathering together what's essentially the final material at actual size. And this is very different from designing for print on a computer where you're working in virtual space and likely at a different scale, a very reduced scale to the thing itself. Basically, you're operating at a greater remove, which, make no mistake, affects things enormously. Now, curiously, the British pop artist Richard Hamilton appears to have ripped this off, the previous cover, sorry. He ripped off this cover for his 1980 book of collected writing. And actually, it's instructive to consider the work of both Richards in parallel, as similar temperaments working in art and design during the same post-war period. Both worked freely across a wide variety of media. Both were firmly rooted in their disciplines' histories. And their work is also similarly marked by a strong literary interest. The key difference is that where Hamilton articulates his own interests, Hollis articulates those of others. But in my opinion, the similarities are greater than the disciplinary divergence, not least in that they both somehow managed to stay young, which is to say, their work never seemed to slip from anything other than a state of total engagement. To reiterate, the perennial problem of a show like this, endemic to showing any graphic design in a gallery, is that it's by no means given that a viewer comprehends A, how and in what context it was made, and B, how those ways and contexts have a knock-on effect on the way things look. The danger is that you read the form as a sort of sealed whole, as though it arrived fully formed from the designer's head. And so you see it as an exercise in style, as formalism to compare and contrast with, say, Art Nouveau or International Style or the posters of Toulouse-Lautrec. This is what happens if you're unable to adequately deconstruct the work, to put it in technical jargon. The point being not to tick the boxes of French theory, but to emphasize that you can learn about graphic designing by performing a kind of calculus on it. You can understand how to do graphic design and other things besides. So another claim I'll make for Richard's work up front is that for those inclined to look for it, to want to learn or learn about graphic design is that it's unusually didactic. In the 1992 conversation on graphic design history, Robin inquires about the anthology Richard was then in the process of compiling. That's the image we saw earlier, Graphic Design and Concise History. This became his first major book, published 2 years later. Richard once kindly assembled this conversation with Robin for me into a little Xerox booklet, which survived until I dropped it in the bath recently on about the 56th reading. What I particularly like about this conversation is how they deliberately keep in a number of digressions. Richard is very digressive in conversation, and as Robin clearly understood, it's useful to see how this character trait feeds into his graphic work, as open-mindedness made manifest. For instance, they're in the middle of talking about those differences between European and American modernism, when Richard happens to look out of the window of his basement studio and notice 2 contrasting British telecom vans. British Telecom, BT, at the time, were the sole public telecommunications company in the UK, until 1984, when it was typically privatised by Thatcher's Conservative government. So this is what Richard saw out of his window, and fortunately ran outside and had the presence of mind to photograph. At first, Richard thinks, this is recorded in the conversation, he thinks that the vehicle behind is an old one that's simply been overpainted by another company. Then he realises it's actually the new BT identity, which had then just recently been implemented. So this is the previous one, up until the mid-80s. And this is the more recent one. And this Pied Piper motif was designed by Wolf Ollins, the trailblazing design firm who pretty much single-handedly introduced the concept of corporate identity, the wholesale repackaging of a company's image according to how it wanted to be perceived, thus inaugurating the era of spin doctoring that, in the UK at least, reached some kind of logical conclusion with Tony Blair's New Labour. Incredibly enough then, Richard's snapshot freeze frames a shift in graphic design, corollary to the socio-political movement, away from the sort of ubiquitous second-hand geometric abstraction rooted in modernist ideas of social construction, which this would be an example, however flawed or naive, and towards an era dominated by public relations and marketing. Robin astutely describes Wolf Ollins' Piper as, quote, such a pathetic, wispy image, pipe dreams, and actually it was publicly reviled to a degree matched only by the logo of the last London Olympics. It was quite famous in the press at the time and was dubbed the Prancing Ponce. Later, as the vans drive off, Richard exclaims, "It's incredible, the old van and the new van. You see, there's graphic design moving away, followed by marketing." And just to give you a further idea of the level of intelligence at work, which is to say the sharp and answerable nature of their criticism, in a later section concerning the work of the Swiss typographer Jan Tschichold, modernist graphic design's first and most eloquent propagator, Robin wonders whether Richard is talking and writing about design purely in terms of formal values or stylization. In other words, he accuses him precisely of isolating aesthetics from context and techniques. But Richard insists not, that what he's trying to do is work backwards and get at the embedded attitudes that underpin the work. Compared to the so-called heroic modernists like Tschichold, he says, there's now a scarcity of serious thinking behind what is, in the end, a social service. And, quote, that's why bad or incoherent design is offensive. He illustrates the point by reading an excerpt from the current draft of his book, then in progress, a description of this poster by Tschichold. Now I'm going to read an excerpt from this texting process. This is a poster of extreme economy and precision. The image is a photograph in negative, its left-hand edge on the center of the sheet. The word element photograph starts at the edge of the image. This is overprinted on the image and so forms a unit of meaning with it, and is the first part of the subtitle, His Apparatus. The second half of the subtitle, His Works, is placed after a dash. The dash bridges between the image area and the white paper of the sheet, so that the works are literally the outcome of the process. The rest of the textual information is related by size and position according to its importance. Where is aligned horizontally with what? This is related vertically to who at the top and at the start of the main title below, and so on. Richard goes on to suggest that the work can properly be labelled heroic because so much attention was dedicated to its realisation, and, via a technical realisation that was by no means straightforward, so much intelligence compressed into the outcome. It records the birth of a graphic language. Now, graphic language, as a term, is the sort of thing that tends to get bandied about and is watery enough to sound profound when it's usually, again, just a poor euphemism for formalism. Here, though, thanks to the sharply focused lens of Richard's patient account, you can really appreciate that the configuration of Chichol's poster has a lucid grammar. Its verbal and graphic semantics are entirely in line, corollary, symbiotic. And this, he concludes, is the real purpose of writing a history. And against the likely demands of his publishers Thames and Hudson, who he says will argue, why provide a lengthy, ink and time-consuming description of an image that's already in front of the reader, he will answer, because without a proper understanding of the social and technical conditions under which it was made, which of course is especially likely if they haven't lived through the period in question, or made things in the way that these things were made, they won't be equipped to read them correctly, or at least fully. Without this graphic literacy, you can't possibly glean the depth of thinking that went into the work. You lessen the potential of extending your own knowledge, and so too your own thinking, possibly including your own ability to graphic design. Otherwise put, without a full account, you lose the full constructive effect, and once again graphic design becomes simply and boringly an exercise in style. Elements arranged one way or another, big or small, red or green, whatever, who cares? I hope you can see where I'm coming from then if I suggest, still paraphrasing Richard, that considered from this angle, the so-called heroic designer carries some actual weight, a meaning quite different to the knee-jerk sense of heroic in terms of heroic modernism, with a capital H, as alluding to that breed of aggressive, father-killing and very male modernist as distilled into the canonical caricatures of, say, Marinetti or Ezra Pound or Wyndham Lewis. For me, though, the killer line in Richard and Robin's conversation comes when Robin coyly points out that Richard is performing an equally heroic act by insisting on writing his very considered description, an approach unprecedented in existing design histories at the time, underappreciated by his publisher, but carrying on regardless. The social cannot be estimated merely in terms of numbers produced or numbers of people who see and use it, writes Robin. It's a question of human spirit and human culture, beyond and against the expectations of societies ordered by accounting economies and material and human waste. Now, to return to the view from Richard's studio window for a moment, curiously, the two vans, one departing and one arriving, also mark another shift, namely in Richard's career at the turn of the 90s, at the moment Robin wrote his new tradition piece. That's to say, the economic and political shift is mirrored in the fact that Richard, like many of his generation of designers who began working in the 50s and 60s, found himself facing the consequences of a transition. The myriad small, inventive studios and individuals with enough commissioned work in the cultural, social and political sectors to casually pass work back and forth between each other suddenly found themselves supplanted by large corporate studios as culture became oriented towards big business and likewise preoccupied with figures, statistics, proofs, and generally counter to the perceived desires of whatever market. And, as like attracts like, these bigger commissioning institutions, with their new departments devoted to developing their public image, preferred to work with other companies of equivalent stature and clout, comforted by the presence of secretaries, fax machines, and group meetings that reflected their own. This inevitably resulted in more diluted and more anonymous work. Luckily, Richard had enough of a reputation by this point to survive this shift. But from this point on, say from around the late 80s to the late 90s when I was working with him, the projects became notably more polarised between the extremely marginalised, work for charities, very small galleries and friends, and let's say extremely protected. He became a sort of designer by royal appointment to Bridget Riley for a while. But rarely anything with a sense of long-term investment in cultural institutions, such as that marks his work for Penguin or the BBC, the Pluto Press, the Museum of Modern Art in Oxford, or the Whitechapel. As Robin summarises concerning the Whitechapel gallery work, when the gallery was reopened in its upmarket guise in 1985, Hollis was replaced by a design group. The new graphic style, in tune with the building, went white and expensive. As we know, by the end of the 90s, the privatisation and corporatisation of mainstream culture was almost total, and remains so. Simultaneous to this, however, the internet upended long-rooted economies of scale, allowing cheap and easy publishing and connection generally, thus facilitating the emergence of the so-called long tail of culture, the flip side of the corporate mainstream, populated by niche interests, countless instances of small numbers of unusually devoted readers and viewers. And I would say that this is where that, quote, heroic attention and dedication, the spirit that Richard lamented as in decline, now surfaces, elsewhere, but by no means eradicated. Again, I'll share a few more thoughts on this at the end of the talk. Now, Richard told me that he recently came across a note to himself from his time as a teacher, which went something along the lines of, "It's far more useful to talk about one work in depth than superficially cut across a large batch." And with this in mind, I want to now look at three specific examples. The first is Ways of Seeing. The book he made is one of a team of 5. Its author, John Berger, an artist, Sven Blomberg, a TV producer, Mike Dibb, and a, quote, critical friend of Berger's, Chris Fox. Working on the book, their roles were less distinct, and there was plenty of room for manoeuvre. Although Ways of Seeing is by far the best known of Richard's work, I make no apologies for showing it here, not least because it gives me the opportunity to emphasise that one of the qualities of Richard's work I admire most is how obvious it is, yet sort of counterintuitively obvious, if that makes any sense. It's so straight that it's weird in a way that makes much other work seem very contrived. Robin once described the work as perennially inventive rather than innovative. There's no ego here, no new for the sake of being new, and this is partly why the work is so exemplary. And here's a word I want you to hang on to, telling. It's always the same in one sense, but always different in another, as is particularly evident in the many years' worth of Whitechapel work. Let me try to clarify this always the same, always different idea. In a favourite typographic exchange of mine, the German artist Kurt Schwitters declared, "Innumerable laws may be written. The most important is, never make it as someone before you did." To which the English typographer Anthony Froschau responded, "Here Schwitters is quite wrong. Make it as they did, unless the constraints are changed. And by way of elucidation, when constraints change, the important thing is not to spray a random pattern across the page, but assess the old with the new requirements." It's important not to take Froschau's reaction as reactionary. If you dwell on this statement closely, say for about 18 years as I have, you might come to realise the following points. First, that constraints or circumstances are rarely, if ever, exactly the same. Second, that all language, verbal or graphic, is by definition based on what someone before you did, on conventions. Meaning is necessarily shared. And third, that Froschau is therefore simply and complexly making a case against novelty for its own sake, but absolutely for clear and lively communication. To Robin's inventive rather than innovative line, I'll add my own alliterative inflection that I think helps shed light on Richard's work's particularity. That it's childlike rather than childish. That's to say, it's characterised not by immaturity, naivety, or ignorance, but is rather intuitive, engaged, and engaging. It's rooted in conventions, but made without preconceptions. Back to ways of seeing. The book was born thanks to a chance meeting in the mid-60s with Berger, then an artist, critic and novelist. Hollis was the art editor of this magazine, New Society, which was a weekly journal of social and cultural commentary for whom Berger was a regular contributor. You can see him contributing on the front cover here. At a party, Hollis found himself talking with Berger and criticising a commentary that he'd made on his TV programme for being exaggeratedly Marxist. The ensuing debate or argument led to his asking Richard to help realise his fourth novel, G. Berger intended to illustrate this in the style of the surrealist chief André Breton's 1928 novel Nadja, which married text and images to form a composite portrait of a Parisian woman. In the end, this idea never really developed beyond the inclusion of 2 small illustrations in the book, though there are notable experiments with spacing paragraphs relative to shifts in time, thought, and meaning that clearly preempt the filmic devices of Berger and Hollis's later work together. Hollis remembers Berger as the rare sort of writer who would be happy to cut or extend his text to fit a paragraph or page, a lack of preciousness that's surely the result of his work as a journalist. Berger must have appreciated the collaboration too, as he asked Hollis to work on the book to be tied in with his 4-part TV series, Ways of Seeing. This was an unprecedented approach to the public discussion of fine art, which was then essentially an illustrated monologue that explored the idea of art as commodity in its relation to society. Begin that sentence again. Ways of Seeing was an unprecedented approach to the public discussion of fine art, essentially an illustrated monologue that explored the idea of art as commodity and its relation to society, to pornography, advertising, biography, children, basically to the everyday, methodically deconstructing and demystifying. At the same time, it was an implicit critique of the prevalent cliches of art on TV, usually based on the model of an expert visiting the great museums, standing in front of a work and reading off art history, which is a technique that only works well if you're a curiously engaging nun. I'd always imagined Ways of Seeing being made by the Ways of Seeing 5 gathered together for the first time like the usual suspects, initially evasive and suspicious of each other, then holed up in a smoky, claustrophobic studio for a few weeks. Richard confirms that this isn't too far from the truth, describing the process on one occasion as trying to make sense of each other's ideas, and on another as trying to make sense of Sven Blomberg's bloody collages, sheets of juxtaposed images cut from scattered books and magazines. These shady pictures are some little 35mm slides that Richard found about 10 years ago when I was still working with him. It gives you some idea of the conditions in which the book was made. When an exasperated Hollis said he had trouble understanding the point supposedly being made by one such collage, Sven Blomberg apparently retorted that it was fucking obvious and stormed out on the balcony to sulk. This is one of the joys of working with Richard, is that I'm not doing it very well, but he always, whenever he's talking about a client or an artist or someone he's working with, he does goes through a cycle of doing voices of these people, and he's a fantastic impressionist. But if the Ways of Seeing weren't always eye to eye, the democratic spirit was carried through in Berger's insistence that the royalties from the first printing were split equally 5 ways between the 5 contributors. Rather than the books being primarily author, editor, or designer-led then, they pushed for a third, uncharted way. Other obvious examples that come to mind are the various collaborations between Marshall McLuhan and Quentin Fiore, or Rem Koolhaas and Bruce Mau, where form and content are developed hand in hand from the outset and so end up similarly symbiotic. As such, they demonstrate what I think of as a sort of truth is stranger than fiction aesthetic, in the sense that a willingness to draw form from content rather than personal stylistic agendas results in work more visually radical than a purely formalistic approach where radicality is itself the main aim. So yes, the book is attractively odd, and yes, it offers a whole new way to think about book design. But for me, an equal part of the greatness of Ways of Seeing is how its design is so bloody-mindedly straightforward. Not least in the way that that childlike bluntness I mentioned begins already on the cover. It immediately announces both its maverick character and its outspoken point of view, just by the way it looks. Burge's opening line, "The child looks and recognizes before it can speak," second line. And the team's subsequent articulation of this line is consistently engaging precisely because the design is so unflinchingly direct. You see the idea of the text starting on the cover before you read the words, just as you see Magritte's image before you read the explanation. All of which is reinforced by that bold type, the emphatically ragged right, unhyphenated text, frequently broken and positioned so as to duplicate and reinforce meaning. There are a couple of image-only chapters, but otherwise pictures of work appear precisely where mentioned in the text, a recurring feature in Richard's work. The size is usually determined first by aligning on the left edge on the unusually large text indent and then centering. The book deliberately avoids interrupting the flow with picture captions. Instead, minimal information is run up the side of each image, with fuller versions pushed to the back of the book. This was also intended to discourage speed reading the book by looking through the pictures alone. The bold type was intended to match the visual weight of the images and form something akin to TV, like hearing a voice as you're looking at a sequence of images. In this case, Burge's strident, manifesto-like tone. I'll just take a break from reading the text just to say, and probably most of you know this book anyway, but one of the best ways of showing what was very particular about Ways of Seeing, and which has been totally eradicated, as Richard says in the video, by later editions that were released by Penguin, is how it uses the kind of linear page-to-page sequence to mimic the linear pull of TV. And the best example of this is this image at the bottom of the right-hand page, where it says, "This is a landscape of a cornfield with birds flying out of it. Look at it for a moment, then turn the page." And then you have exactly the same image and handwritten, "This is the last picture that Van Gogh painted before he killed himself." And of course you can imagine easily enough how that's playing out on the TV screen. We're just going to watch the first couple of minutes of the first program from Ways of Seeing.
This is the first of 4 programs in which I want to question some of the assumptions usually made about the tradition of European painting. That tradition which was born about 1400, died about 1900. Tonight, it isn't so much the paintings themselves which I want to consider as the way we now see them, now in the second half of the 20th century, because we see these paintings as nobody saw them before. If we discover why this is so, we shall also discover something about ourselves and the situation in which we are living. The process of seeing paintings or seeing anything else is less spontaneous and natural than we tend to believe. A large part of seeing depends upon habit and convention. All the paintings of the tradition used the convention of perspective, which is unique to European art. Now, perspective centers everything on the eye of the beholder. It is like a beam from a lighthouse, only instead of light traveling outwards, appearances travel in. And our tradition of art called those appearances reality. Perspective makes the eye the center of the visible world. But the human eye can only be in one place at a time. It takes its visible world with it as it walks. With the invention of the camera, everything changed. We could see things which were not there in front of us. Appearances could travel across the world. It was no longer so easy to think of appearances always traveling regularly to a single center.
I am an eye, a mechanical eye. I, the machine, show you a world the way only I can see it.
One of the things a lot of people don't realise about Ways of Seeing is that the book was actually made after the TV series, very soon after, to kind of cash in on the success. And you can imagine how it would be a very different thing if it was made the other way around. Also, you realise how, in book form, you lose the distraction of like hairstyles and shirts 40 years later. As well as all the other aspects of the design I've mentioned, I'd say that the book's departure from convention is most extreme, perhaps inadvertently, in the fact that, like the TV series, it self-reflexively draws attention to its own design. Berger noted it too, writing in the opening pages that, quote, "The form of the book is as much to do with our purpose as the arguments contained in it." Ways of Seeing shares a family resemblance with a few other Hollis designed books that are in the vitrine upstairs. And as you probably saw, for most of the exhibition, we were very generously allowed to just leave everything totally naked, without plexiglass, without any sort of protection. But when it came to the books, although they're not particularly precious, they're quite easy to find on Amazon, most of them. Of course, there was a problem of showing them flat, so that's why the stuff at the end of the wall, if you didn't get that far underneath the window, is placed in the vitrines. So as well as Berger's G, that I also already remembered, and the Breton book, Nadja, this was a later book, The Seventh Man. And just to show you a quick spread of how this integration of text and image was used and carried on being used in particularly inventive ways. The book on Godard, that I mentioned earlier. And this book in particular is interesting, and a shame that you can't actually flip through it in the show, because simply for the fact that Colin McCabe, the critic, was writing the book as he went along, and they'd literally be in the same room, and he'd finish a chapter and give it to Richard. And it has this really strange sense, it was made based up of, sorry, not strange sense, but has this very strange form, because Richard had to guess where there would have to be gaps in the text to allow him to insert images, captions, and footnotes. So it has this very kind of strange rhythm and this sort of expanding and contracting grid of text. So again, it very clearly bears the trace of its making in the final form. And the last one I want to show, which is a much lesser known book, is this one. Humphrey Jennings was part of a group called Mass Observation in Britain in the 50s after the war, that went around observing communities and society, and then would produce reports on them. And it was a kind of surprisingly big and popular movement. And Humphrey Jennings was part of that group. And I think, in a way, this is the most fully realized of, it's the last of this series of books, which weren't actually a series, but in my mind are a series of books that all did similar things with integration of text and image, and that were all based in some form on moving image in the first place. Most are thematically concerned with film already, so Hollis's appropriation of the medium's techniques is particularly apt, and under the influence of a few similarly cinematic works, and the one that he always refers to is Chris Marker, a French documentarian, his book Commentaire, which Marker actually laid out himself. You can see the obvious influence there. So these are the senses in which I consider it a decidedly obvious book, and one that feels accordingly inevitable, with that strange sense, strange for something so radical, so unprecedented, of being hard to imagine any other way than it is. I think of it twinned with the other massively populist and actually popular cheap standard from the other side of the Atlantic, McLuhan's Medium is the Massage, though both emerged under quite different conditions. I'd always shown Ways of Seeing and the Medium is the Massage as a pair to students as examples of intimate working relationships. But as it turns out, the opposite was true in McLuhan's case. sound bites excerpted from his writing were actually compiled by a shadowy figure called Jerome Agel. He's down at the bottom there, listed on the back cover as a coordinator, or perhaps more aptly a catalytic converter, and the pile was given to the graphic designer Quentin Fiore, not pictured on the back cover, who translated the material into a series of self-contained spreads on his own. So where Ways of Seeing was an emphatically communal project, Medium is the Massage was the result of various parties working in isolation at different times and places. As usual then, there are no hard rules for ideal ways of working here. Each new situation creates its own ideal conditions, but lessons can always be learned from talking about their specifics. Not everyone liked Ways of Seeing though. Setting the entire thing in bold Universe 65 was akin to sticking a British two fingers up at the sort of well-mannered book design maintained by Penguin's chief designer at the time, Hans Schmoller. Apparently, the first time Schmoller saw a copy of Ways of Seeing back from the printer, he threw it down the corridor in fury. The twinkle in Richard's eye, as he recounts this anecdote, points to a couple of other qualities of work: a casual disregard for authority and convention, and a refusal to take himself too seriously. So the second instance of work I want to consider in some detail isn't quite so particular, meaning it's not just one thing, it's a bunch of things. It circumscribes some of those recurring aspects of his work for the Whitechapel Gallery. Richard always remembers this as an exemplary client relationship, usually illustrated by an anecdote about the original commissioning director, Mike Glazebrook, calling him to say that he'd just seen the poster for the upcoming David Hockney exhibition and assumed that Richard was happy with it. When Richard replied, unfortunately not, that he thought he'd fucked up the typography, Glazebrook suggested that they reprint it with whatever changes he wanted made. Here's the slightly hilarious outcome. Hilarious only in the sense that the type, which originally filled the whole of the lower half of the poster, was quickly cut and pasted from an accompanying leaflet, the original one eradicated, and this little bit stuck discreetly in the corner so as not to disturb Hockney's images. That's what's down there. Typically, this was then overprinted and folded to double as a private view invitation. I said before that Richard's position career-wise at the moment those vans pulled up outside his house mirrored broader social and cultural changes at the time, and again in graphic design shift from some kind of social branding to the full-blown designer culture obsessed with mediation and identity that it's now hard for us to imagine otherwise. The vans chime yet again, though, with another vantage on Richard's work, which is the transition from a relatively dogmatic approach to something far looser. In the new tradition, Robin makes much of Richard's travels to continental Europe, relatively grand tours that would, of course, have been far less easy to arrange or afford than now. And during these trips, he met a number of the artists and designers whose work interested him. During this period, Hollis was into concrete art, which he describes as that in which the form is worked out by adhering to preconceived rules, often mathematical. Here's an early painting of his. The relative proportions of the stripes are based on units of 3, and the pattern repeated after the central axis. He calls it a visual statement. The graphic design corollary was that which emerged from, or at least was most fully realized in, Switzerland after the Second World War. Richard's second major history book from 2006 documents this movement, variously known as both Swiss modernism or the international style, typified by a few other accomplished practitioner theorists like Karl Gerstner, Joseph Muller-Brockmann, and Max Bill. The name international style is something of a paradox. One of the genre's defining features is the use of complex, rigid page grids. But grid templates are useful in Swiss books in particular because most books there were set in 3 languages, German, French, and Italian. A designer would be required to accommodate all 3, often on the same page in order not to have to repeat images. And this required clearly articulated pages, frequently based on a 3-column grid, and so often came across as clinical in appearance. But there are many other benefits of adhering to a strict grid. In Richard's work, for instance, they fostered the alignment of text and image in visually pronounced and grammatically consistent ways. Thanks to a number of imported magazines and a small number of influential teachers, the Swiss style was fairly commonplace in 1960s London. One particularly Hollisian touch, though, is the large text indent, often employed as a second aligning axis. Again, this feature was by no means gratuitous, by no means merely stylistic, which isn't to say that it wasn't stylish or became something of a personal style. You can probably recall this kind of extended first line of a paragraph from Ways of Seeing, for example. It's easy enough then to identify Swiss tendencies in Richard's earlier work, but more formative perhaps is that the large format folding document he titled I. This is the thing that you meet head on when you walk into the exhibition. It's a record of a trip to Castro's Cuba, and Richard was responsible for all aspects of its production, from taking and developing the photographs and writing the observations to sticking together both in a negative on a glass sheet lit from below by a lamp to form a makeshift inverse paste-up table. A printing plate was made directly from this master, the title later added in red pen, plus a local rubber stamp as a final touch. Most notably prescient here, though, is his inventive use of the folds as a physical grid to direct the unfolding narrative, a generative restriction used to work out the relative balance of order and freedom. The DNA for a lot of what came after in Richard's work is folded into this self-made piece, and it's plain to see how this thinking informs and plays out in many different ways over the total of 15 years or so, over 2 terms, that Richard worked for the Whitechapel Gallery. We already saw the large indent in Ways of Seeing, as I said, but while you can see many of the same features carry over into the Whitechapel work, it has a number of markedly different demands, and so the same device plays out in markedly different ways. For instance, where the book involved a linear thesis sustained over 160 small format pages, the Whitechapel's invitations, leaflets, pamphlets and posters, and sometimes all 4 compressed into a single item, were variously designed to unfold as initially discrete and then gradually composite panels. So this is typical, and you can see a lot of examples of this upstairs, where this would be designed to fit into a standard DL envelope and would open up into a poster. And all the type and the images would be specifically designed so that as you unfolded 1 into 2, 2 into 4, and 4 into 8, you would get a sort of progressive sequence of information that would end up as one composite piece. Much of this kind of work was informed by a drive for economy that Richard thinks of as influenced as much by his upbringing in the austere conditions of post-war Britain as by the actual Whitechapel budget. The drive for economy of means, how to achieve the most with the least, was of course also a common modernist dictum. But these folds became as much part of the identity as the typeface, which is a redrawn version of Block, a German font dating from the same period as the Whitechapel building that seemed to mimic its distinctive architecture. And here's a picture of the Whitechapel building with the identity that came some years after Richard was replaced by a design corporation or a big design studio. And you can see it sort of adheres to Robin's description of going expensive and white. Two-colour printing was another consistent tick, a cheap, limited palette that Richard expanded by combining varying percentages of half-tone rasters and overprinting to make something approaching black. I'm just going to skim through a number of things. Again, I think all of these are upstairs. But again, just imagine that this work was really in the heart of when stuff was being made by paste-up, so everything made one-to-one scale on a drawing board, stuck together. And again, I think you can really see the trace of that process in how it was made. You can imagine it happening that way. Another thing Richard always emphasizes is breaking text by meaning. And this is a very good example of that. So units of sentences within paragraphs are broken, and for instance in the title you can see that the various parts of the sentence are emphasized by this kind of working with different rasters and different colors and getting the most out of these, out of the minimal printing budget. In all this invention, you can probably appreciate that childlike thinking again. Just a few more. And on this leaflet in particular, you can see how this kind of logic works. Long lines set across the full width of the page, but few enough so as to remain legible. Images range both on the text indent and centered according to a few reflexive parameters, whether the image is landscape or format, how big they need to be to read the point of the illustration, the relative importance as major reproductions or reference thumbnails, and simply how they fit the page relative to the text flow and overall sense. Everything affects everything else, and as such it's more plastic than concrete. The arrangement is more derived than imposed, and the grid is more a facilitator than a sergeant. Here's another example, an announcement that again progressively unfolds into a poster. All is semantically configured, lines broken and blocks of information arranged according to a sense that operates equally at macro and micro levels. To quickly refer back to what I was saying about the comparable work made by Richard Hamilton around the same time, in particular, I wanted to show an insert that he made for the Beatles' 1968 White Album, whose original eponymous title, The Beatles, was overridden by Hamilton's iconic design, which was conceived as a reference to contemporaneous art chic, and very Swiss, as it happens. Hamilton's idea was that the individual Beatles on this pull-out and insert into the LP would dominate 4 of the 6 square panels, each collaged in such a way as to work as a discrete composition, but then also made to combine into an overall composite poster when unfolded. So you can see the same kind of thinking at work, the interest in capturing a work in movement which assembles itself as you open it out. And just for the sake of it, here's one of my favourite posters to demonstrate Richard's undogmatic approach to the identity. Practically all of the trademark features that I just inventorized are absent here. No recurring typeface, no 2 colors, no folding or emphatically semantic configuration, and yet the poster still clearly projects the Whitechapel's character. In this case, because Richard has good sense enough to leave the image alone. And in the end, the gallery's identity consists, I would say, precisely in this good sense, rather than any single element or set of elements necessarily assembled over time via the way of working. Which is to say, contrary to the way that this sort of identity gets changed again and again and again, typically when a new director comes into the institution, then part of what makes this work good is that it was developed over such a long period of time, I think covering something like 15 years, as I said. I want to prologue my last example by showing a small card by another cross-generationally influential typographer that I briefly mentioned earlier, Anthony Froschau. He was a famously severe, temperamental character, but far and away the most eloquent importer of the modern movement into Britain in terms of graphic design. Although older than Richard, they taught at the Royal College around the same time in the 60s. And Richard once told me that during some of Froschau's classes, he was called in to translate Froschau's ideas from English into English. And the implication of this was that his reasoning was too complex, or perhaps too linguistically high-flown or technically specific for students to comprehend. I'm showing this card of his as a phosphorescent example of what I described earlier as a pedagogically charged piece of work, and the sort of thing that influenced Richard too. One of the nice things about working with him was to be occasionally given stuff like this as and when it fell out from behind a cabinet or slipped from between a stack of posters he was in the process of shifting from one drawer to another. So we're looking at a postcard-sized sample chart. It's a tiny little thing about A6. Oh, We're not looking at it at all. So much expanded. And what it is as you can probably see, is a kind of specimen sheet, a sample sheet of a bunch of typefaces that were available in Froschart's printing workshop. For a number of years, he moved out of London, lived in the countryside, and did very small-scale, low-run jobs for local schools and local businesses. And so this was a way of just demonstrating to a client, potential client, what was available, and also as a kind of record for himself or for the workshop. And what I want to emphasize with the card is, again, how there's an incredible amount of information sort of intelligently configured into this small space. So how it works is basically centered around the axis down the middle, where you see actual examples of all the typefaces. So they were just taken one-to-one printings from the type. And they're grouped in a few different ways. First, according to this classification that runs up the side. So whether they're modern typefaces, what are called eccentrics, or what he called eccentrics that didn't fit into any other category, Egyptians and sans serifs. And then coming off the left-hand side, you obviously have the type sizes that were available. And to the right, you have the name, and you have some information about the designer and the year that it was made. And I think that the red and the black is used to distinguish between type sizes that weren't yet in stock, that he didn't yet have, but he was expecting to get in the near future, including the two typefaces whose names are in red as well. It's plain to see then, I hope, how the subject matter of the card, the material possibilities of a particular press, along with the card's specific purpose, to show it as clearly and quickly in a smaller space as possible, have determined what I propose we might consider an authentic configuration. Authentic in the sense that it's been articulated true to the intrinsic nature of the information. This is also to say that the configuration functions in the first place according to the extrinsic communal conventions of language. As such, and as high-flown as it might sound, this is then a piece of social work. Recall again what Richard once said. Plainly, my own view of design is that it is inevitably part of the social servicing, and that is why bad or incoherent design is offensive. And Robin Kinross once expanded on this, quote, multiplication of text is a social act that provides a forum for dialogue and exchange. Deliberately making text hard to read is thus a public offence. Consider a page of words that say something of interest, set in an ordinary typeface without pretensions. In its freedom and order, it is a model for social arrangements too. And this is the third and final piece of work I want to show. Richard's 1968 poster for Murray, which was a student protest movement. This is the first poster in the show as you go upstairs. By now I assume that you can read the work in the sense I've been propagating, and so I'll leave it to you to look at it for a minute. The only thing I'll add, because it's unclear from the screen, though readily apparent from the real thing upstairs, is that it was fed through the machine the wrong way round, widthways, in order to be printed to graduate between two colours along the length, from a negative signifying black to a positive signifying red. Again, you can see the trace of the thinking involved, and how it's this thought that survives its dated and marginal context. To wrap this up, one of the major shifts since Richard slowed down his work rate is the proliferation of people who started out as, let's say, straight graphic designers branching out into other roles in the broader ecology of communication. In other words, over the last 10 years or so, they've begun working not only at the coalface of graphic design, but doing the commissioning or producing or selling themselves, DIY. There have been countless instances of people trained or otherwise versed in graphic design, starting up publishing imprints, galleries, summer schools, event spaces, journals, magazines and shops, myself included. And I'd simply say that this is a logical extension of the reason many people get into the field in the first place, to share information and to articulate it accordingly, precipitated by a scarcity of engaging work already, or conducive relationships and mutual respect with clients, which is itself a consequence of the overwhelming influence of big business and corporatization of the areas graphic designers typically worked in when Richard began, coupled with the vastly increased hordes of emerging so-called creatives. I have to admit I'm not entirely sure how I feel about this, so I prefer to let it hang as an observation rather than a conclusion. I wanted to mention it only because I don't think that the commitment to hard thinking and constructive communication that Richard lamented as having all but disappeared since Chichold and his modernist ilk has disappeared per se, only been displaced. In the face of what seem to be apparently diminishing, if not yet extinct, opportunities to work in more obviously social areas, whether that means designing public transport signage or government forms or culturally oriented publishing imprints beyond the grip of the marketing mentality, and here I mean the digital versions of these things too. This cultural diaspora have started preoccupying themselves by manufacturing culture rather than graphic designing it, or actually to manufacture it in order to then graphic design it too. They make their own work. And while on one hand this could be seen as entirely positive, not to say romantic, on the other it's difficult to see how it can be sustained without the support of private or state subsidies in one more or less clandestine form or another. And equally difficult not to feel that this is going to dry up at some point very soon, once various cultural policy plugs are pulled, as happened in the Netherlands a couple of years ago. It's also hard to ignore the feeling that the situation produces simply too much stuff made with too much love, if that doesn't sound preposterous. I can't be alone in walking around events like Printed Matter's book fair at PS1 last weekend, feeling that the amount of printed matter being lovingly produced with often astounding dedication and no less astoundingly refined graphic design seemed out of all proportion to its imagined readership, and that there's no way more than, say, 5% of this avalanche of printed matter can possibly matter. Or at the very least, be adequately digested relative to the amount of work put in. In short, the system is out of whack, and I'd anticipate an impending survival of the fittest on the horizon, that something has to give. Okay, I'm generalizing wildly now and possibly delusional, but I like to imagine that exhibitions such as the one upstairs, showing work that was produced under such distinctly other and largely lapsed conditions, might excite actual commissions that emerge from the kind of social spirit that originally generated much of it in the first place, from outside as well as inside the arts. Even Richard has spent the last few years publishing and editing and designing a few books by friends and colleagues under his own imprint. And in this sense, I'd say he remains entirely in tune with the current generation of those who still pass for graphic designers on the basis of his own definition. That is, those who are in it for culture rather than capital and conceive of graphic design as something more than mere marketing, something made instead with what I'd call a telling intelligence. That's it. Thank you.